My name is Ben Meath. I'd like to welcome you to The Haunted Scribe, a channel where I make audio recordings of short stories I've written from the past. The reason why I'm making a video with my ugly mug here is because my videos are not doing too well as of the moment, and I'd like to increase my viewership and my subs, as just about everybody else here on YouTube does. So I wanted to get into a discussion about horror. So today I decided to get dressed up in my finest clothing and have a discussion with you about what makes things scary, why horror works. And I've divided it into two categories. One being a visceral horror, one that where you react to it right away. It doesn't have to do with guts, although that's part of it too. If you've seen a lot of horror. The second one is a conceptual horror. Now I will talk about this later, but right now, and there's a third category that's kind of in between, I would put it, because it has, and I'll discuss that as well. But first, I'll start with visceral horror. This is horror that usually comes from a gut reaction, a quick instinctiveness, and sometimes this isn't always instinctive because there is some tension and build up to it, such as a jump scare, such you know it's coming as a jump scare, or something. The other part of this I would include would be a kind of gore that is nauseating and will affect you. There are great examples of like extreme horror, things in terms of novels and in terms of film. I guess one great example, one of my favorites, is the film Dead Alive, which is just a bunch of just gore and a lot of fun. And I'm not putting these down either. I see these moments in film as being comparable to slapstick comedy. Now, slapstick comedy is usually considered the lowest of the common denominator, but in reality, it's more an art that is, and a skill that is very hard to accomplish and get, and it takes extremely skillful people. An example of that may be like a Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin, if we're going to go old school, or a lot of others since then. It's extremely hard and takes a really good reflex driven kind of, I don't know what else you'd call it, kind of professional comedian to pull off. Same is true with gore effects, I guess you could say. Like you'd need like a Rick Baker or a Tom Savini, although this is more for jump scares. I would say I would consider jump scares a hard act. James Wan seems to be great at doing that. When you watch something like The Conjuring, there seem to be great jump scares, and like Insidious as well. Of course, you don't really get that here. I'm also talking about books as well, and you don't really get a jump scare in books. Maybe some graphic novels I've experienced that before, but I will also talk about kind of the second model of horror, not putting down the first. The first works at a visceral level. It gets your midbrain involved before it can get its way up to the processing center, which is the cerebrum up here. So it's somewhere up here, get to the cerebrum. There's a lot of good examples of great jump scares. I said James Wan usually, and even there are films that are highly conceptual horror that do have jump scares and not mutually exclusive categories. And a lot of good horror has gore that does work very effectively. I guess one of the great examples is like David Cronenberg's body horror, which is quite disturbing, even in something like The Fly, which I didn't mention The Fly because they were talking about it on Red Letter Media, and highly recommend. I think I probably agree most with like Jay Bauman's assessment of horror. And then there's the second category, which I consider conceptual. And I'll talk about the third, kind of the synthesis of these two categories. I'm not saying they're like thesis and antithesis, but I do find more value in conceptual horror. Okay, conceptual horror. Now this has a variety of meanings. This kind of works on your cerebrum, but it does have, these are areas connected. Your neurons have to go through the midbrain, the hindbrain, midbrain to get to this section, so they're not mutually exclusive. But a lot of these ideas are concepts, things you think about that terrify you, things that, like, this can also be reflexive as well, such as thinking of like situations where, horror does have a good way of one great example would be, the thoughts that occur in your head if you go to the beach. You might be worried that somehow if you're at the ocean, there being a great white shark out there. One of the great examples, one gave you that idea and implanted it in your head. One of them, maybe immediate fear, but one of the great examples, I guess, was the movie Jaws. One of the great things about horror is that you can place yourself within, access those situations in which you see. So you can put yourself in the place of someone who is being chased by a stalker. Of course, if it's done well, you usually are frightened and horrified. Otherwise, you get a situation like your typical slasher movie from the 80s where you think everybody involved is an idiot and you know better than they do. Of course, I would caution, they're badly written movies, but under certain levels of mental duress, you make bad decisions. That's something to also keep in mind. However, one example I think that works incredibly well is in a movie like Devil's Rejects, where at the beginning they're escaping their farmhouse and they need a car. And what do? They have like Sherry Zombie lie down in the middle of the road, and a good Samaritan comes by to help her out, checks her out, and I think the Otis Sitwell comes and just stabs her to death. An aspect challenge us and make us not feel as safe as we would. It is also a good outlet for feelings of, dread and of real life situations. Right now, I'm going through a horror of my own. I'm not going to talk about it, but you do find some kind of comfort in these movies as well, which I don't know if I'd put that maybe in conceptual, because it helps you deal with the psychological issues pertaining to life, and it helps you basically process your fear and understand it, which some great movies do. Now, I also want to point out another aspect of horror is that, yes, you can put yourself in the place of the victim, usually, or even the killer. Sometimes you get POV shots where where it feels like you're the one doing the stalking and you have no control over your own body, like the victims. And another important aspect of that is lack of agency. Now, you may have a fear of your house being surrounded by zombies getting in, biting you losing your sense of self and becoming one of them by dying. And it's scary to think that in a lot of ways zombies and monsters in general are satirical. They show us, in the true sense of the word, Latin word monsteri, they show us what we are or what we're capable of becoming, and that kind of horror is quite scary too. I mean, this more through a lack of agency, becoming like the wolf man. It could be being bit by a wolf. In the original 1941 movie Wolfman, Lon Chaney Jr. gets bitten, and through no fault of his own becomes a werewolf, in which he has no control of, and he ends up being killed at the end. Spoilers. What's scary about that is the real life situation of horror at the time that probably resonated with the writer of it, who was a Jewish man, who was writing this in the late 1930s, 1940s, where what was happening in Europe was probably on his mind, and being Jewish and not being able to control how people saw him as a threat or whatever, as a nuisance or whatever they wanted to see him as, they ended up, something he couldn't control, and that's just like the wolf man. So there is a lot of different ways in which horror can communicate us the truth, and that's what its highest art form it does. It also tells us things we don't want to know or even believe, such as, in this world, does it dabble in nihilism? Yes. A great example of this is in the film Jaws, where you have the very beginning, a woman who's being attacked and she is going to be killed. When she's clinging onto the dinghy, she asks, God, please help me. And it doesn't matter. She still gets eaten in the end. There's no divine intervention. That's one aspect. I'm kind of tiptoeing around because I don't want to get into any kind of debate about whether God exists or not. I don't care about that for this section. But moving on, so there is that aspect that we are alone in the universe, that we are basically, that we're alone on this earth, and that there's no divine force protecting us, and that is quite horrifying. Unless you don't believe in any of it, then I guess it isn't. But to contemplate it, even I would say, even if you didn't believe, is still, you might not understand the full complications or consequences of such a belief, and horror may, catapult you into better understanding that. Now, another thing is when you have characters who you relate to on the screen, and that's what great horror can do, is it can make it very easy to displace, or to place it can make it very easy to place yourself in the shoes of the main character. And sometimes we see that happen, and we watch as a character does something that we wouldn't do, something horrifying that you do not want to go down, and you watch in horror because you know you can't stop them, and you wonder if you would do the same thing. Another one great example is in the Midnight Mass, the Flanagan Netflix series, when the main character, I would say the priest, does something. He's a well-meaning guy. He wants to help everybody on the island. He sees his own impotence at what he can't help people, and he wants to very much help everyone. But he does so by making a deal with almost a devil, in this case a vampire. And what ends up happening is he commits an act that you, as an audience member, like, no, please don't do that. Please don't do this. And every time you watch it, if you watch it on repeat viewing, you may still hold those views and know that what is coming is inevitable. Another good example of this, and I'm not going to really say anything about this movie, but I suggest you watch it. I know the director, Roman Polanski, F him, but I will say that the movie Repulsion has the same kind of thing, where there's a right decision to be made, and this person makes the wrong decision, and it's horrifying to watch. Now, another aspect, I think I've covered what I want to. There may be other good examples to be picked out. I guess another film that shows lack of agency is the movie Get Out, where you have the main character go to a farmhouse to meet his girlfriend's family, and they praise him at the beginning as being all these stereotypes that they see as good stereotypes, but what those stereotypes end up doing, and because of what happens at near the end of the 3/4 of the way through, is that he ends up losing his agency, literally. And so calling somebody a good athlete or whatever, like good at cleaning and whatever, a good servant, is, wrong anyway, but is something that is completely dangerous in its own right. So I'll move on from that to the third, which is a combination, a synthesis of the two that I talked about, and that's kind of this area of the uncanny where you get the visual connected with a mental picture as well. And the examples of this, and this is more where I guess they use the best example I can think of is Gabe in The Office, when he talks about narrative being a comforting thing, and that not his exact words, but how narrative can comfort people and times. Even horror movies, you get like 3 acts, you know what's coming, you know that there's going to be a jump scare, there's going to be a climax. This is a little similar. This is the best way I know how to describe it. There are scenes in movies that kind of make you jump back and like take you out of your comfort zone. One of the great examples I think is that scene in The Shining when I think it's Wendy Torrance. It's Danny Torrance in the book, but when Wendy Torrance walks down the hallway, looks into a room, and sees a man on the bed, sitting on the bed, and a man dressed up as a dog. And I guess you could call that a service dog if you want to. But that scene just takes you out of whatever like you think the movie is, just for the moment. And of course, you get in the book, I think it's Danny Torrance who sees it, and you get it kind of makes it more clear on what's going on there. Maybe that was an unnecessary thing not to be included, but I think you get the idea from where the dog is like crouched down. Dog man is crouched down, I should say. Another great example of this is when watching the movie Exorcist. And this is actually a deleted scene because it might have been too silly to include, but it's one of the freakiest scenes I've ever witnessed in a horror film, and that's when Reagan Crowd walks down the stairs. It's like, what am I watching? What is this movie? It's moments like that can take you out of your comfort zone and take you out of what you expect and subvert that and turn it into that what you expect in this world is not. So that's, I kind of, that may be more conceptual. I just work these are arbitrary categories of what I've come up with. I've not done any other research much on this, but that's how I believe that horror works, or through the two categories of, in conclusion, the two categories of visceral horror and conceptual horror. There may be more. I may have combined things that shouldn't be combined. And then there's like a third synthetic category that combines the two and aren't basically separable from them. So I talked a lot about horror. I tried to make my case here. Please if you thought this was good, like it, subscribe, and if you have a disagreement or agree or disagree, please let me know in the comments. I thank you for watching. Peace.